on several occasions in the New Testament, both in the Gospels and in the epistles, Jesus is explicitly called God. How do you explain these verses, the grammatical meaning of most of which is quite straightforward? 2 minutes.
Okay, I would argue that Jesus is called God once for sure. In the Psalm 45 quoted in Hebrews 1:8, "Thy throne, O God." Immediately there's a God on top of him, by the way. And his God has given him that throne. I'll grant that one. Scholars will argue till the cows come home. We don't want to bore you with grammatical and syntactical issues in the other verses that claim that Jesus is called God. I don't think they're valid at all. Many Trinitarians I could cite you do not think he's called God in the other 7 or 8 texts. So that's a matter of grammatical debate, and it's rather tedious. He's not called God. The Father's called God 1,300 times. Those are Unitarian statements, every one of them. And I find that rather simple.
Joseph?
My statement goes back to the same thing, that he says, "I came in the name of the Father." He represents the Father in everything that he does, that he is basically the agent of the Father. Everything that he does, he says, "I do nothing of myself," that what I do is what the Father gave me to do, what he's empowered me to do.
Well, the faith of believers is found in Titus chapter 2, verse 13, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. Now, it's not obscure grammar and syntax to emphasize that here the Apostle Paul identifies Jesus as God and Savior. This is pointed out in 2 different ways. First of all, not only can we make a very strong argument based upon the Greek text that Jesus is described both as God and Savior here, and I would refer you to Dan Wallace's fine work on this particular subject. But the context demonstrates that that is the only way to understand Titus chapter 2. You only have one person in view in Titus chapter 2. And when verse 14 goes on to say, "Who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works," those texts are all Yahweh texts from the Old Testament about the covenant God of Israel. Psalm 130, verse 8, Ezekiel 37:23, Exodus 19:5. These are all about the things that Yahweh would do being applied to Jesus. So does it make any sense whatsoever to say, well, in this text, Jesus could not be called God and Savior, when the very next sentence, part of the sentence, identifies Jesus as Yahweh? Jesus is identified as God over and over again in the New Testament.
When you mention Hebrews 1:8, quite explicit, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever," quoting from Psalm 45:7. And then you say there's another God on top of it. It sounds as if you're talking about 2 gods. I'm holding to one God. Let me go beyond that and say that as you continue reading, it says about the Son, he says, "You, O Lord, in the beginning, just like John 1:1, created, made the universe." That will wear out. So there are many explicit verses.
Thank you. Response? 90 seconds.
Yes, there are lots of Yahweh texts in the Old Testament that apply to Jesus. He's his shaliach, his agent. Everything that Yahweh does in the Old, Jesus can do in the New. It doesn't make him Yahweh. There's only one Yahweh. We keep talking about 2 Yahwehs. Very difficult. Only one Yahweh. That's the Father. Jesus does all this Yahweh stuff, the God stuff in the New Testament, searches the hearts and the minds. Of course, as shaliach, he's empowered to do it. That's wonderful. So I don't accept any of these arguments that this makes him literally Yahweh. He's representing Yahweh. If Joe sends me out on a job, I am Joe in Hebrew thinking. Not Joe, but Joe.
Final rebuttal.
You know, if Joe sends you and you are Joe, I'm sure when you go home to snuggle with his wife in bed, she won't accept that. So let's recognize that the agent is not identical to the one sending. The agent can have the authority of the one sending, but they didn't see the alleged agent in the Old Testament. They saw God in the Old Testament, who was identified as Jesus in the New. When you make reference to 1,300 references to the Father that say he's God, that's the very point. It specifically speaks of the Father over and over and over again because of God's triunity. The primary New Testament revelation is that the Father is God and Jesus is Lord. When you look at the texts that explicitly call him God, I hope you both could say with Thomas to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." When you look at them explicitly, the only answer is Trinitarian. Otherwise, we have multiple gods. You're the one creating multiple Yahwehs, not us.
And you've got to understand, the description of Jesus as Yahweh in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 through 12, cannot be made of a mere man, because the attributes that are being described there from Psalm 102 are of his unchanging nature. The fact that while creation will pass away, he himself does not age. He is immutable. That cannot be applied to a mere man. It has to be applied solely to the one who was the creator of all of those things in Psalm 102, and then applied to Jesus in Hebrews chapter 1.
Thank you very much.